Hello everyone, Neuvillette has dropped and it's safe to say he's shaping up to be a pretty crazy character. When built he can deal tons of damage, and by being Hydro, he's playable in all kinds of teams, and I mean a lot. So to make his teams easy to understand, I'm gonna share some of the best teams to play him in. I'll explain how they work, their rotations, and how to build them should builds differ from how they normally are. Let's keep this intro short and jump right into the first team, Hyper Carry Neuvillette. I don't know about you guys, but I've come to really like Hyper Carry teams. They're a nice break from the usual reactions we've been playing since launch, and with Neuvillette's kit, he can be a really good Hyper Carry. His charge attacks deal a lot of damage, and in one rotation, thanks to his skill and burst, he can charge attack twice or 3 times easily. His teammates of course also play a big role in making Neuvillette a hyper carry. You want to pair him with characters that will buff his damage as much as possible, the best being Zhongli, Kazuha, and Mona. You're probably wondering where Mona is. As some of you probably know, I don't have Mona. But if you do have Mona, which is seemingly everyone except me, she's really good with him. She will increase his damage significantly through her kit, as well as enable for the Hydro Resonance, which also makes a good increase in damage. Mona is great all around, but if you don't have her, you're welcome to use any sub DPS you see fit. However, a great candidate for this spot is Fischl. She's a very good choice because she deals high damage, and in fact even deals more damage with the new Golden Troop set. If you guys have this set, I highly recommend giving it to her, all while spending very little time on the field, so Fischl won't get in the way of Neuvillette's high field time. Last but not least, Fischl will trigger Electro Charge, which is good since it's a reaction, and since it plays into one of Neuvillette's passive talents, where if a teammate of his performs the Hydro reaction, you will gain a buff to his charge attacks. This team will give him 3 stacks of the talent, which is really nice, but that's the gist of how the team works. Let's get into how the actual team plays. Start with Zhongli's shield, then cast Neuvillette's skill and burst. Next, cast Kazuha's skill and burst. And lastly, Fischl's skill to activate Oz. At this point, you go on the offensive and charge attack with Neuvillette. Once his charge attack is done, do another one right after. Once you've performed 2 charge attacks, cast Oz once more since his duration will be complete, and charge attack again with Neuvillette one more time. Now let's move to another strong team, of which I've been actually using more than the Hyper Carry team. It is Freeze Neuvillette. Freeze is a really good reaction with Neuvillette, primarily for 2 reasons. The first is that it solves a weakness of his. With enemies frozen, you don't have to worry about being interrupted when charge attacking, which can be a big headache and ruin your damage. Secondly, Freeze takes full advantage of his charge attacks AoE. Since enemies will be frozen, you can easily damage them all at once and increase your DPS by a ton. For this team, you can use any cryo sub DPS you'd like, such as Ganyu or Rosaria for some extra crit, or Ayaka, who I prefer. Though she is commonly used as a main DPS, Ayaka's burst deals tons of damage. It is very high, so it's very viable and effective to use her as a sub DPS. In the right order, when enemies are frozen with their burst, and when she's paired with Neuvillette, you'll just shred enemies. This combo is very deadly and very satisfying. The last thing to note is that Zhongli is a flex bot, though he is really good because of his resistance shred, of which applies to Hydro and Cryo. This was probably obvious that he's a flex bot because it is counterintuitive to run a shield in Freeze. But the thing you'll notice when it comes to building Neuvillette teams is that he doesn't have a dedicated support. There's no unit, maybe Farina in the future, where they buff HP and say Hydro damage. As such, we have to work with general supports that help Neuvillette in some way. And aside from Mona or Kazuha, Zhongli is a version of these supports, and a good one at that. For the rotation of this team, it's much like the last team. Begin with Zhongli's skill, Neuvillette's skill and burst, and again Kazuha's skill and burst. At this point, switch to Ayaka and use her skill followed by her burst. Right after, charge attack twice with Neuvillette, and watch enemies' health disappear. As for builds, you have the option of building Ayaka in 2 ways. You can build her in her normal DPS build. For example, you can still use for Blizzard Strayer since this set is tailor-made for Freeze, and that's what we're still doing. but if you're going with Blizzard Strayer or her DPS build, you need to prioritize energy since in this team Ayaka is burst focused. So whether it be through her artifacts or weapons, Ayaka is going to need quite a bit of energy at around 190 to get her burst back reliably. The same energy guideline applies to the second build, which is a traditional sub DPS build. For example, I'm using this build and I gave her for Emblem of Severed Fate with the Favonius sword. The Fav sword on her might make some of you Ayaka mains cringe, believe me, I don't even main her and that made me uncomfortable. But the reason I did this is because Ayaka sees very little field time. Legitimately, she has like 5 seconds on the field. All she does is use her skill and then immediately after her burst, and she's not used until the next rotation. Because of this, she's not able to gather a whole lot of particles and get her burst off cooldown. So to fix this, she's using the Fav sword, but you don't need to use this sword. You can use any sword as long as you're near the energy amount I recommended. Now let's shift to a team where Neuvillette isn't the main focus, but a driver of sorts. It is Hyperbloom Neuvillette. Though we've passed Sumeru, Dendro still remains an incredibly strong element because of its reactions like Hyperbloom. When it comes to Neuvillette and Hyperbloom, I must say it's not the best version of the team. That's not to say it's a bad team or that it's weak, but really in exchange for the higher damage the best Hyperbloom teams have, Neuvillette's team have the pro of range and shielding. For example, for Alhaitham Hyperbloom, his best comps don't have a shielder, and with this playstyle you have to be up close and personal, which of course leaves you open for attacks. But for Neuvillette, because of the range his charge attacks have, you can perform the reaction from a safe distance, and currently his teams do require a shielder, so you're not going to get hit even while at a safe distance. You can just sit back, relax, turn on the washing machine, and watch Mr. Clean do his thing. Another thing to note is that an important addition of this team is Raiden. Essentially, without her, this team comp wouldn't work. In this team, she's built in her Hyperbloom build with pure EM, and she makes this team possible because of how her skills work. No matter how far you are, as long as you hit an enemy, her skill will go off and trigger Hyperbloom. Kuki, though a viable option for this team, can't do this. If you're using Kuki, you'll have to be close to enemies because of the limited range her skill has. Anyways, the certain washing machine buttons you have to press to deal the most damage is first Zhongli's skill, Raiden's skill, and then Nahida's skill and burst. In the same order, use Neuvillette's abilities. Last but not least, then activate his charge attack. Be sure to charge attack 3 times and then repeat. The last thing to note for team building is that of the team that I showed you, it can be greatly improved. For instance, instead of playing Zhongli, you can play an extra Dendro unit like Baiju or C6 Kirara, or instead you could play another Hydra unit. This will allow for more cores to be produced and thus increase your damage by a lot. The next comp I have for you is a classic Hydra team, but honestly a 50-50, Vaporize Neuvillette. What I mean by 50-50 is the way this comp fits with Neuvillette. With jungling in this team, Neuvillette's gonna have to be near enemies, but with no shield unit in this comp, it's very easy to get hit, and even if you try to dodge hits, you will end his charge attacks short. This on its own might make you want to skip this team, but this team deals high damage. Speaking of damage, another problem this team faces is with its main support, Benny. Benny doesn't buff Neuvillette in any way. He'll heal him sure, but doesn't help him in any other way aside from this. It's then wise to switch Benny for a different support, but with how much attack Benny gives to Kazuha and Xiangling, you'll be missing out on a lot of damage if you replace him. A safe version of this team would be then to use a shielder instead of Bennett, but honestly, I'd say one of the flares of this team is its high risk, high reward playstyle. Yes, you'll be taking damage or having to dodge a lot of attacks, but when you perform your reactions, you deal so much damage that it's worth to play this team. And the way that you play this team is, as always, Neuvillette's both abilities, then the skill of Kazuha. After this, quickly activate Bennett's burst with the skill, and then use Kazuha's burst to swirl Pyro. This will buff Xiangling, whose burst and skill you use right after. Now charge attack thrice with Neuvillette. When you're attacking, try to move so enemies will have a hard time to hit you. Well everyone, that is all the teams that I have for you today. I hope you try these teams out, and if you do, please let me know what do you think of these teams. Do you think they're strong, and do you have any sort of changes that you'd make to these teams? And for those that are using any different teams than the ones that I shared, please let me know what teams you're using. And with that, I'm gonna end the video. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you all for watching, take care, and thank you all for watching once again.